When I talk to my clients in the last 10 years, I noticed that many of my clients, if I would ask them what do they want to get out of the therapy or the coaching, many of them, some jokingly, but many very seriously, say these same words all over again. I just want to be happy. Even though that sounds very logical, because many people just want to be happy, that is not achievable. Because when you analyze those words, I just want to be happy, you're basically saying, I wish to be in a constant state of contentment. If you just think about the implications of the meaning of those words, we can never be in a constant state of anything, let alone be in a constant state of contentment. But yet, many people actually just want to be happy. You got to realize that all our senses are actually made to observe the outer landscape. That's the world that we live in. That's the world that I can see here, the trees, the leaves, everything that's around me. That's the outer landscape that we live in. And all our attention is actually on the outer landscape. Even our body can be our outer landscape. However, when I talked to people with a depressed state, everybody uses language like it's dark or it's cloudy or I can't see light at the end of the tunnel. And I started to take those words very seriously. And I became aware that when you're really depressed and down and out, all the symptoms that a person has of being passive, not experiencing meaning, when let's say somebody says, let's do something nice, the person can actually say, well, let's do it, but I don't feel what it means, what the word nice even means. It actually makes a lot of sense when you realize that the inner landscape of a depressed person is actually dark. It's, in my opinion, it's dark and closed off. So just let's assume that you're locked up in a completely dark room with no exit. And the only thing that you can think of as a goal is that you just want to be happy. You want to be in a constant state of contentment. Do you think that in a dark room where you're locked off from the outer landscape, you can ever reach this constant state of contentment? It's my experience that actually striving for something that is actually outside of this dark room, outside of this dark space, reinforces the dark space that you're in. So striving for just being in this constant state of contentment is, in my opinion, actually a trigger for depression. It's one of the assumptions that I discovered. It's also in DSM-5 now. It's like if you're not happy, or then you have a disease. Let's take this example. Let's say a woman is married for 25 years very happily. She comes home and she finds her husband in bed with her best friend. Yeah, and she kicks them both out. And she's devastated. She cries and she cries all the time. And 2 weeks later she goes to the doctor and she says, I want to kill myself. I feel so down. Normally, in all the other DSM numbers, 1 to 4, previously to 5, that would have been a reason to give a person medicine and say to the person, you're depressed. But nowadays with DSM-5, let me give you the following example. Let's say a woman is married for 25 years and she comes home and her husband is dead. And she cries and cries days and days, and 2 weeks later she goes to the doctor and says, I want to kill myself. I feel so unhappy. Until DSM-5, that was actually not a reason to give somebody medicine, but to just say to the person, well, you're in mourning. You really need to get through this. But now in DSM-5, it is actually exactly the same as the other example where the woman finds her husband in bed with her best friend. And that's a diagnosis of depression. So the whole line of what's a normal reaction to what's going on in your life and what actually is depression is totally started to fade. But to give you another example, the advertisement world actually started to implement fear of rejection as a way of inducing temporary happiness. So let's say if you don't have the right iPhone, you know, all your friends would say that you don't belong to the group. So in order to belong, you can actually be happy, but you need to do something. You need to buy something to get to this state of happiness. So we're actually constantly inflicted with doing something in order to achieve this ultimate happiness state. It's actually my experience that striving for this constant state of contentment is inducing depression. So I started to wonder, so if we're not looking for happiness, what are we actually looking for? So if you're in this dark room, what are you looking for? And I started to notice that the first thing that you want to achieve when you're in this dark space where you can't get out of, which is like a blanket or a sheet that you're actually looking through. That's why depressed people can be depressed a very long time before they are actually diagnosed with depression, because they're just in this state of disharmony or not feeling satisfied, because they're never aware that they're in this dark room. They're actually always looking outside, which is a natural phenomenon because our senses are focused on the outside world. Well, a couple of things happened simultaneously about 10 or 12 years ago. First of all, I became depressed, and it was very strange because I had a lot of knowledge and a lot of information and a lot of techniques, and strangely enough I didn't do anything about it. But what was even more strange is that I didn't know I was depressed at first. I was just very unsatisfied and unhappy. And what happened, a client suddenly knocked at my door, and working with clients was the only thing that I could actually do, because the rest of the time I was just sitting at home doing nothing. And I got a client, and the strange thing happened. As I talked to him, I actually heard him say the things that I felt. And I thought, that's strange, what's going on with this man? And after talking to him for 1 or 2 hours, I started to explore a little bit more. So what's going on with him? Suddenly he said to me, "My God, I think I'm depressed." And then I thought, my God, so am I. And that was actually the beginning of me becoming curious about depression in the first place. Yeah. So I moved on from there, and I started to explore two things. One of the things was I wanted to know more about what we assume about happiness, because a lot of people strive for happiness, and I was one of those people. I thought that happiness was the thing to go for, and I thought, so what do I know about happiness in the first place? And the other thing I wanted to know is, what do I know about depression currently? And from that, the question rose, what do we all know about depression? I had this idea of what if I could understand happiness by exploring what a depressed person actually experiences. So actually to get to the root of happiness through the eyes of depression. And that's when my modeling started and my research started. And I worked with many clients to explore their depression strategies, basically. So that's how it all got together. Well, one of the things that really struck me, because I noticed from my own experience that I was very passive in my depressed state. And one of the things that I noticed is that all the things about depression that popped up in my mind were related to what we know from the DSM manual, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychiatric Disorders, DSM-5 currently. I started to explore what we actually know about depression from DSM-5. What I started to realize is that we assume quite a few things related to the diagnostical manual. I actually started to call it DSM thinking. One of the things that I became aware of is that if you realize that DSM has been written by psychiatrists, and psychiatrists are obviously doctors, and a doctor does basically two things with a medical problem. You either operate on it or fix something, like a bone, or you actually medicate somebody to fix something. Those are the two options you have when you're a doctor. And it struck me that the basis of DSM thinking, especially in relation to depression, is that depression is an illness, which is quite logical when you think about it from a psychiatrical point of view or a doctor's point of view. But that notion, I realized within that notion we completely miss the relationship between how I give meaning to my reality. So obviously when I run up the stairs, my heart rate goes up because my blood pressure needs to rise, and there are some hormones and some mechanisms in place that need to make my blood pressure rise, which is completely true. And obviously we need substances in our brain like serotonin and all that kind of stuff for us to function properly. But I started to realize that what DSM thinking actually teaches us, which is an assumption that the substance is the cause. And I started to realize that that assumption, I think, is false. If from my perspective, depression is not a disease. It's actually a complex of symptoms, and the substance is not the cause. I had to do research to find the causes of depression, and I actually found 3 causes for depression that I actually see with all my clients. I haven't seen them written down somewhere else. Depression is actually, let's say, a problem without a cause. I realized that it couldn't be without a cause. And in interviewing many clients and working with groups and through research, I started to realize that, that there are actually 3 causes that trigger a depressed state. Depression is not just a singular state. It's not something like confidence or lack of confidence. It's actually a compilation of states, which I call a gestalt state. And that's why it's so complex. That's why people talk about so many things when they're depressed, and why many therapists or psychologists don't even know where to start with a depressed client. But actually, if you just look at the gestalt, you just see somebody who's somber and down and doesn't give meaning anymore to things and experiences. But if you look at the parts of what caused it, it makes actually a lot of sense how this gestalt came about. One of the things that I noticed with my clients is that people who get into a depressed state experience loneliness at 2 levels. The first level of loneliness is loneliness related to people who are close to you. What I actually mean by that is that within the family or friend system, the person experiences that they are alone. So just imagine that you're in a room full of people, you've got loads of friends, and somebody would ask you, so do you feel together with all these people? And somebody who feels depressed would actually say, well, no, even if I'm with my friends or family, I can feel alone. So that's loneliness at one level. But loneliness at another level is existential loneliness. It's like the sense of being alone on the planet. So I actually talk with clients who have a very bad relationship with people in general. Just the other day, I talked to a client after asking, said that she hates people in general. Period. Which explains that her inner landscape is very lonely. So that is one cause, and the other cause that I find fascinating is a sudden change of self-image or identity. And the word sudden is really important because it's not a slow change. Actually, it could be a slow change other than consciously, but the awareness is very sudden that somebody's sense of self has changed. Let me give you an example. I worked with a gentleman who was 50 years old, or 51 by the time. And he said to me that he's been down for about almost a year, very, very down for about almost a year. And we started to trace that back. So when did that first start to come about? And he told me that he suddenly realized that at the moment of his 50th birthday, his 6-year-old son came into the room. So he was quite an old dad. And his 6-year-old son came into the room and he sat on his lap. And he held his son like this, and in this particular bedroom there was a mirror wall, so he could see himself in the wall, in the mirror. And when he held his 6-year-old son, he suddenly saw himself in the mirror, and he realized that he wouldn't see his son become very old. And from one second to the other, he had this experience that he was not as young as he thought he was. Because what he saw in the mirror was a completely different image. He saw an old man suddenly. So his self-image on the inside, in his inner landscape, and on the outside, they weren't compatible anymore. And that shock actually was his trigger for depression. And the third cause that I discovered is a chronic sense of setback. So you can say, let's say, if somebody, you can break your leg, and then once you're recovered, somebody steals your bike, and when you're over that, you lose your job. And so those are all real setbacks, you know, like real life setbacks. But what I noticed, which is even more important, is the perceived setbacks. So let's say I'm waiting in line in a queue, and somebody jumps a queue, and people who get a depressed state have this continuous experience of having setbacks in their life, even setbacks like this. Oh, somebody jumped the queue. They shouldn't be doing that. It shouldn't be done. It's not the right attitude to have. The world is not doing it according to my plans or wishes. And as this constant sense of setback happens to a person, they get what I call a bad luck mentality. And they get this experience of, oh, it's me again. You know, there I go again with all the troubles. And what I notice is that with all my depressed clients, they all have at least 2 of these causes that triggers depression. So loneliness with a sudden change of self-image, or loneliness and chronic setback, or a change of self, and either of the other ones. But it's always 2. It's never one of them. And that actually changes somebody's inner landscape. It changes the inner world. It's fascinating to see that when these causes come together in a person's life, then putting them all together changes the inner experience from bright to dark, from open to closed. And a person starts to feel disconnected from their inner landscape to the outer landscape. It's as if they're separate from the world. Well, loneliness is a very important part of the depressed gestalt, and it's really an important question to get this fundamental internal change in landscape where there's nobody around you, to actually having people around you, feeling acknowledged by others and recognized. And one of the things that struck me when I worked with some priests is that one of the priests told me that from his perspective, God is actually the biggest, let's say, inspirator for acceptance that he knows. And then I realized that what if God, if we can see God like that? I wasn't brought up religious, so I can actually just look at it from a therapeutical point of view. And I use that metaphor, for me it's a metaphor, to work with loneliness with my clients. And one of the stories that I tell them is that God actually looks at human beings as complete and accepts them fully as complete. So all their flaws and everything's there, they're all complete. God actually just say, I acknowledge you as you are. And what you can do with your clients is you take them into this story and ask them to see the planet, the world, all people in society through the eyes of God, or a God, as they what they consider their specific God, but with this very specific notion of full and complete and utter acceptance of humanity and everything that lives on the planet. And once you get this very broad perspective of complete and utter acceptance, I always ask them to actually go back to the moment that they were born themselves. So their mother is there, obviously, and maybe their father. But now there's a third entity there, which is this almighty being. He looks at that newborn through the eyes of complete and utter acknowledgement and acceptance. And I let them do that for a while, and of course I do some other things as well. But that basic perception and perspective actually changes the way people perceive other people around them. So that's the beginning of change in loneliness I do with my clients. What I truly believe that the inner landscape of depression is a gestalt state. So it's a whole, and by looking at the whole, you can never actually create one goal to thrive for or to strive for, because that's always how should I say, too small. When I hear my clients, when they went to, for example, other psychologists or even psychiatrists, people work on a specific goal. You go walking, you know, to get into a better state, or maybe you could even lose weight, or just enjoy your life or whatever, and even some interventions. But all these interventions are too small. So what I do is I actually try to transform the complete gestalt, which is the whole molecule, everything it consists of. So the loneliness, the self-image, the setback, the whole, that creates this whole gestalt, and it all needs to be transformed in order for light to appear in the landscape. Because when the smallest amount of light starts to appear, that's actually when happiness starts to come alive. So happiness is not something that's far and away. It's not an end goal. It's never constant. It's actually the smallest piece of light in this landscape. And so I actually bring people back into the darkness for the light to appear, instead of looking for the light